Linken Sphere was a bad idea. This might surprise you, but there is no mechanic in Dota 2 that is as unreliable, inconsistent, and responsible for bloated code as spell block. If it wasn't a holdover from Dota 1 and IceFrog decided to just add it as a new mechanic today, it would almost certainly be a rejected concept. It turns out there is no good way to implement spell block. Let's find out why. Linken Sphere has a strange legacy. Originally based on the Warcraft 3 item, Amulet of Spell Shield, it was always unintuitive what would and would not be blocked. For example, a spell would be blocked when unit targeted, but worked if you targeted the ground next to them. But for the most part in Warcraft 3, it didn't get much more complicated. There just weren't that many spells. If you targeted a unit, the spell would be blocked. Of course, it was never actually that simple. The truth is, there is no default behavior for spell block. Every interaction has to be specifically hard-coded into every ability. It just isn't possible to define a simple rule that determines when a spell should be blocked. Think about it. Spell block doesn't actually block the spell when you cast it. For example, if the spell has a projectile, it will only be blocked when it hits the target. But what does that mean for a projectile to hit a target? If it's a spell that bounces, does the bounce count? What if we fire multiple projectiles? What if the caster itself is the projectile? And even for spells that are blocked on cast, we still want the spell to play its effects, like the sound in any particles. That means getting far enough in the cast for that code to run, but not far enough that you're actually casting the spell. For example, Finger of Death will play the particle in sound, while Laguna Blade just plays the sound. In other words, even if every spell was instantly blocked on cast, you would still have to code custom logic, and we still have to account for different behavior. We need to group every type of spell, from AoE targeting to bounces to multiple projectiles, and determine how they should interact with spell block. How hard is that? Well, let's try it ourselves. Let's try to define every category of spell that can interact with spell block. First, the instant block spells. These are spells that don't have a projectile and are blocked instantly on cast. Next, single target spells with no side effects. Examples are Ensnare, Soul Assumption, and Chaos Bolt. So far, everything has been straightforward, but with our next group, things start to get murky. Spells that have AoE effects around the target, like Stormhammer and Unstable Concoction. With these, the AoE is blocked completely if the target has spell block. However, spell block won't work if it targets another unit next to you. Next, and I can't believe this is a distinct category, spells that start as single target but through an upgrade become AoE. This is where things start to get weird, so I'm going to go through each of these individually. First, Finger of Death. With Scepter, the ability becomes an AoE centered on the target. However, unlike the previous category, which had the same selection criteria, it triggers Linkens on every target in the AoE individually, as if you had cast Finger on each unit. Mind Flare and Brain Sap work the same way. That's consistent, but personally I don't think there should be a distinction between upgraded spells and basic spells. Especially considering not all upgraded spells work like this. For example, Lion's other ability, Hex. At level 25 it can become AoE, but unlike Finger, which is an AoE centered around the target, this becomes ground targeted. And now that it's ground targeted, it doesn't proc spell block at all. Okay, so upgraded spells proc spell block on each unit if they remain single targeted, but don't proc it if they're ground targeted. I don't like it, but I can sort of understand the reasoning. Except that isn't true. Gleipnir and Lightning Bolt are both ground targeted, but trigger spell block. Meanwhile, Sinister Gaze, Shadow Strike, and Cold Feet don't trigger it at all. By the way, while I was working on this video, Valve removed Facets, and in the process changed Void. Previously, it was a ground-targeted spell that procs spell block, like Gleipnir. Now, it's unit-targeted, and still triggers spell block, so that's kind of a fix. I also want to mention Electric Vortex. Like these other spells, it's a single-target spell that becomes AoE, but instead of being unit-targeted or ground-targeted, it centers the AoE around Storm. It also does not trigger spell block. I think that's probably how it should work, but this goes to show how ambiguous some of these categories are. Next, let's discuss another type of single target AoE ability, Ether Shock and Poison Touch. They both target up to a certain number of units in a cone. How do they behave? Well, Ether Shock is blocked completely like Stormbolt, while Poison Touch triggers individually like Finger. I think that makes Poison Touch the only unupgraded ability that can trigger spell block multiple times. So that gives us 5 different subcategories of AoE spells. Unupgraded unit-targeted AoE spells, upgraded unit-target AoE spells, upgraded ground-target AoE spells, upgraded no-target AoE spells, and unupgraded unit-targeted cone abilities. In my opinion, this is a hot mess. Is it any surprise that with so many subcategories, Valve lost track and ended up with some inconsistent behavior? If it were up to me, I'd simplify the groups like so. First, don't distinguish between upgraded and unupgraded abilities. I don't care which direction you decide to go, Stormhammer and Finger of Death should behave the same way. Second, ground-targeted spells should never trigger spell block. If this is a balance concern, change the ability back to being unit-targeted like they did with Void. Do that, and there's no question how Electric Vortex should work. Third, Poison Touch should work like Ether Shock. It should also get the AoE indicator that Poison Touch has. It's possible that cone targeting for these spells is different on the back end, but if that's the case, just change them to be the same. These changes would go a long way towards making spell block more intuitive. So that's all the AoE abilities. But would you believe we're not even halfway done? Let's keep going. Next up, spells with multiple projectiles like Stifling Dagger and Arcane Bolt. These spells are blocked independently for each projectile. They also behave consistently. Nice. Less consistent are next group, spells that bounce. Back in the day, these spells would be blocked completely if you targeted someone with a spell block. That's since been changed to block the impact of the first bounce, but then continue bouncing. The bounces do not trigger spell block. I don't like this change. It's weird that spell block triggers, but it doesn't actually do much to stop the impact of the spell. Still, this was an intentional game design choice, so I'll respect it. But it does not seem like every spell got the memo. Shuriken will stop bouncing once it's blocked and can be blocked on bounces past the first one. The Harpy's Chain Lightning won't bounce if it's blocked, but it doesn't get triggered on its bounces. Seed Shot from the Warpine Raiders will keep bouncing and trigger spell block on each bounce, so if you need to trigger a bunch of Linken Spheres, pick up a Warpine. And before they removed Facets, Cloven Chaos would not bounce at all if it was blocked and get blocked on a bounce. That's 4 spells with 4 different behaviors. Shuriken maybe I could accept since its bounces rely on track, which makes it distinct, but Chain Lightning and Seed Shot were clearly just oversights because they belong to neutral units. This highlights another issue with spell block. Because every interaction is hard-coded, when you change how something works, it's easy for obscure spells and edge cases to fall through the cracks. Also, what is a bouncing spell? Because Lightning Storm doesn't seem to count. It's completely blocked. Sure, it doesn't have a projectile, but then neither does Arc Lightning, and that one works. I'm going to say this was an oversight. Next, projectile spells where the unit itself is the projectile. These are spells like Lifebreak or Charge. These spells get their own category because unlike normal projectiles, where the spell is blocked when the projectile lands, these are blocked on cast. I guess because the mobility is a large part of the utility of these spells, but then why do bouncing spells work? That's always going to bother me. Next, spells that can be both unit targeted and ground targeted. I mentioned this at the start as the original weird Linken Sphere interaction, and Valve has cleaned this up by just removing all of the abilities that can both unit target and ground target, but there are still some holdouts. The main one is Sprout, which definitely needs it. Imagine how annoying it would be if you couldn't select a target. Satyr's Shockwave also can still be unit targeted, and like Chain Lightning and Seed Shot, I think this is probably just an oversight. It also doesn't trigger spell block if you unit target. Finally, let's talk some edge cases. Urn and Spirit Vessel don't trigger spell block, even though logically they should, because of balance reasons. It's not a great precedent that you can just arbitrarily decide some abilities won't trigger spell block, but I get the reasoning. The Fell Spirit Neutral Creep Silence doesn't trigger spell block at all, even though it absolutely should. Again, Valve kind of just forgot about the neutral creeps. Soul Rip will block damage on the target, but still drain from the surrounding units. Lightning Bolt will give True Sight, but only if you ground target it. Fire Blast will stop multicasting if any of the casts get blocked. Any other spell that's multicast, though, will get blocked individually. And Nightmare triggers Linkens if you break it by attacking a unit that has been affected by an enemy Nightmare. Okay, this one's actually just funny. I think that's everything. Well, not everything. Like I said, every spell is unique, but I think we've covered most of it. So, what have we learned? Well, first, I hope I've convinced you that spell block is just intrinsically a bad idea. It was less bad in Warcraft 3 when there weren't that many targeted spells, and the ones that did exist were fairly simple. But in Dota 2, especially after the addition of shards and talents, there's just too much. I've done my best to divide the spells into categories, but even within those categories, there are tons of exceptions. Even after doing all this work, I still would have a hard time telling you what the intended behavior of a new spell might be. And clearly there are some oversights. Here are my suggestions for things to change. First, AoE abilities should be streamlined like we discussed earlier. Upgraded abilities should not have special behavior. Poison Touch should be reworked. Second, bouncing spells should all follow the same rules consistently, including Lightning Storm. I personally don't like that it bounces after being blocked, but if we're doing that, you have to be consistent. And third, fix the neutral creeps. It's obvious you forgot about them. Just make them work like everything else, and for God's sake, fix the Fell Spirit silence. Finally, I want to clarify that this is not a result of poor programming. There's just no good way to make spell block work. If you really wanted to have it work consistently, you'd have to cancel the spell when it's cast. No sound, no particle, and especially no projectiles. And that would just be so much worse. I'm glad they didn't do that. I'm glad they've taken the time to make spell block feel good, even if it's sometimes confusing, and even if it means there's going to be mistakes. And I'm glad it exists in the first place. I think Linken Sphere makes Dota a better, more interesting game. But if spellblock is this complicated, what does that mean for Lotus Orb? Or Soulbind? Are there other mechanics that are just as likely to break things? Yes. Tune in next time, where I'll cover those, as well as Rubik, Morphling, and Status Resistance. Look forward to it.